planning at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. As you know, I guess it sounds natural, his interests are in transboundary water conflict and cooperation, water security, and water governance. So that, Jacob.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate being invited, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program. But first, I want to just give a little bit of a bigger picture scenario here, just talking about groundwater resources in the world. When we look at this is a map of transboundary aquifers occurring across the entire world. When we look at transboundary aquifers, there are over 600 in existence. So it exists all over the world. Groundwater itself is the most extracted natural resource in the world. More than half of humanity's fresh water for everyday uses, such as drinking or cooking or hygiene, comes from groundwater, as well as about 20% of irrigated agriculture. So this is a very significant resource. And when we look a little bit more regionally, it's very significant here in the border region. This is a map of the four transboundary aquifers that are featured in the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program. And from west to east, you see the Santa Cruz and San Pedro aquifers shared between the states of Arizona and Sonora. And then you have the Mesilla and Hueco Bolson that are shared between New Mexico, Texas, and Chihuahua. And so why are these aquifers featured? Well, let me start by giving a little bit of background about the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program. So when we look at those four aquifers, all of these aquifers share to different degrees the problems of declining water levels, deteriorations in water quality, and the increasing use of groundwater by municipal, industrial, and agricultural users. In total, there have been approximately 36 aquifers identified across the border region shared between the United States and Mexico. But these four have been featured here, and there have been a number of efforts that have led to this. You had some legislation on the United States side, the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Act. You also had a number of studies that were conducted both in Mexico and in the United States on these shared aquifers, but not necessarily in a binational context. And there have been several events that have led to this. The key is that with this program, it is about assessment, not necessarily management. And the reason for that, well, there are many reasons for that. First of all, the parties agreed that there would be no requirements of management for either country that would be as a result of this process. And second, if you were ever to dream about management in the future, you first have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know what exactly is in these aquifers, what are the issues at hand for each of these aquifers, and it's good to establish a binational base of knowledge. So what led to this Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program? Perhaps the most significant piece was the cooperative framework that was signed by the principal engineers of the International Boundary Water Commission and SELA. This is the key in terms of binational cooperation. IBWC is the binational coordinating agency. And so this joint cooperative framework focus is about improving the knowledge base of transboundary aquifers between the United States and Mexico. And so this is about scientific cooperation. There are binational technical advisory committees that have been established for each identified transboundary aquifer. And both sides, both countries have an interest in preserving and understanding these aquifers that are used by both countries. And so this team of binational experts has been key in terms of trying to understand what the resources that we have that we're dealing with. And so some of the components of this cooperation include the assessment of these aquifers, exchanging data, developing new data sets, and the IBWC is key in terms of providing the framework for these binational coordinations. And so this cooperative framework, it specifies that binational technical advisory committees will be established for each of these aquifers. Funding, each country provides any project costs in their countries. And countries are also allowed under this framework to do independent tasks in their own territory. And so, one of the things that's really special that's come as a result of this, I'm going to speak a little bit more about the Arizona Sonora component because that is what I'm particularly working on, but it should also be acknowledged, and I see some team members here in the audience that are also working in Texas and New Mexico and in Mexico as well. But one of the big results that we're very proud of as part of the TAP program includes the binational study of the transboundary San Pedro aquifer. And if for those of you who are curious, I happen to have several brochures that come and explain a little bit more about the report itself and the information composed inside it. So feel free to contact me. I'm more than happy to not take home more copies. So feel free to ask me for some. But what's really significant about this report is that it's the first ever binational aquifer study that's prepared and released simultaneously both in English and Spanish by the International Boundary and Waters Commission. So this was the result of a lot of coordination. It had to go through several steps of review on both sides, and we're very proud of the fact that we have this binational, bilingual source of information that was composed and collaborated by both countries. Some of the information that's included includes the physical geography, the hydrography and hydrometeorology. You have a conceptual geologic model that's included in the report, hydrogeology, hydrogeochemistry, and so on and so forth. And there were also several maps that were binationally created. I have to acknowledge my colleague Elia Tapia, who was really intimately involved in the creation of many of these maps. And the creation of these maps were a task unto themselves. One of the significant issues involved different classification systems for the same units. So you had one system of classifying geologic units on the Mexican side, you had another system of classification on the American side, and figuring out how to harmonize those two sides required a lot of negotiation and back and forth, and these binational teams really had to work together in terms of figuring out how to harmonize these maps. And so, if you look at the map to the left, you see that, on north and south of the border, that you had completely different maps. And you were able to kind of come up with an agreed upon framework that allowed for these two studies to really figure out how to harmonize these maps. So as I said, there's plenty more information in case you're not interested in reading the hundreds of pages in the report just here, and there's several key pieces of information that we ended up featuring in this binational brochure. And it's both in English and Spanish, as you can see. Just to kind of sum up in terms of current relations between the United States and Mexico, including groundwater. There's no treaty specifically on groundwater between Mexico and the United States. And when we deal with transboundary issues, they go through the IBWC on a case-by-case basis. But it's important to emphasize how there's a common interest on both sides in terms of improving aquifer knowledge. Another challenge that is involved in terms of assessing these aquifers and continuing the scientific investigations are the legislative differences between both countries. In Mexico, you see more of a federally framed framework for management in terms of water. In the United States, you see more of a state level and sub-state level for water management. And so figuring out how to harmonize those two is another thing that requires a lot of work and back and forth. And so there's been some other significant accomplishments that have occurred regarding the TAP. You've had a number of binational meetings that have been held. You've had, my colleagues in New Mexico and Texas have furthered the development of the Mesilla Valley hydrologic model. There's several other research projects that have been funded and are currently being funded. Articles, we have an article that is hopefully coming out in the Journal of Hydrology, Regional Studies, about the uniqueness of this cooperative framework and the cooperative process that we've been working on. And there's several other things that are going on that I won't get into right now, but there's still plenty of work to be done. As you can see by this list, this is recommendations from the technical team regarding work in Arizona and Sonora. And so we hope that this is just the beginning and the start of a very fruitful partnership to continue evaluating and assessing these shared aquifers for the betterment of both of these countries. And so with that, I just want to mention that we also have a website at the Water Resources Research Center that focuses on the TAP. The USGS also just released their website that focuses on TAP information. So feel free to examine that. The website is in English and Spanish for our page. So with that, I'll close and just say thank you for your time and your attention.
Great. Okay, our next speaker is Bill Hargrove. Dr. Hargrove has a PhD from the University of Kentucky, an MS from Texas A&M. He is now with UTEP at the Center for Environment and Resource Management. Has done a lot of work on water quality, watershed planning. Of special interest is that he's traveled 25 countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa, in studies on water and water resources. So, Dr. Hargrove.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is going to be a little bit more of a progress report, I would say, on a research project that we are leading in the region. The full title of our project is Sustainable Water Resources for Irrigated Agriculture in a Desert River Basin Facing Drought and Competing Demands, from Characterization to Solutions. And although agriculture is in the title, the funding we receive for this project is from USDA, so their main interest is agriculture. We're taking more of a one water kind of approach to this project because I don't think we can look at the sustainability of water for just agriculture in a silo. We've got to look at all of the users and all of the sectors and stakeholders who are involved. We have a number of other universities who are participating in this project, including a number of the people who have already spoken this morning, but also people in the audience. New Mexico State University, University of New Mexico, Texas A&M AgriLife here in El Paso, University of Wausahoota, Michigan Tech. And the project is funded, as I said, by USDA, $4.95 million over 5 years. We are just starting our 4th year of the project today. So we have 2 more years of the project. The area that we are focusing on is what we call the Middle Rio Grande. I know that's used a little differently maybe in New Mexico, but it's basically from Elephant Butte Reservoir down to where the Rio Grande converges with the Rio Conchos. This is our primary area of interest for the research project. Of course, as already has been talked about this morning, and I'm not going to read all of these, but we're facing a number of challenges in the region. Not only the uncertainty of climate and maybe the certainty of drought, but also growing demands for water and growing competition for water, especially. So I would say the overarching question that we're trying to address in this project, which is the $5 million question: how can water be managed in this region, in this part of the basin, where all of the main users can have a sustainable future? And that includes agriculture, urban industrial users, and environmental users for ecosystem services. Our project is also, Dean Maldonado mentioned about the importance of involving stakeholders, the public, and all the users of water, and this is something we have tried to do in our project. We started with first doing an analysis, well, who are all of the users of water in this area? And this, I think, summarizes basically everybody. Every single person here should be in at least one of these boxes. If nothing else, you're a direct user if you drink water, and probably many of you are in multiple of these boxes. So on the right-hand side, we have the kind of the direct users of water. In the middle are more of the suppliers, distributors, maybe NGOs who are advocating for certain positions and uses of water. And on the left-hand side, the state, federal government agencies who are the policymakers, regulators, and so forth. And at the bottom here are more that I would term the information providers, who includes research, academic, and people who provide science-based information. So as we move forward in this project, we tried to engage stakeholders from every single one of these boxes. And we started our project with a series of kind of focus group, town hall meeting kinds of meetings and discussions with people to talk about, first, how do they see the future of water in this region, and then maybe what are some of their important questions that they would like to have answered through our research project, and just issues that they see for the future. So just to show you that we actually did this is one example that actually Dr. Alfredo Granados led in Mexico. I should make that point too, that we included stakeholders, not just from the U.S. side, but from the Mexico side, included. This particular meeting, I believe, was a meeting with some government agency people in Juarez, but we also had meetings with farmers in the Valle de Juarez and other kinds of users in Mexico, as well as Texas and New Mexico. We've had now maybe 20 or more of these kinds of meetings. I don't have time to summarize everything we've learned in all of those meetings, but this is just a word cloud that does summarize what people's concerns are from the stakeholder point of view. You can see there easily the biggest word is quantity, and that's the biggest concern in this area. Climate, sustainability, quality, especially salt content and salinity issues is a big issue. So basically, our overall approach is to focus on these issues and questions that the stakeholders are most concerned about, what they told us. And I would just summarize maybe the top 4 as these that I have listed on this slide. So easily, number 1 was prolonged drought and how to cope in prolonged drought. Urbanization, land use change, urban sprawl is kind of a second most important issue. Salinization is a big one. And then the last one, what will it take to get more conservation? And I mean, I could reword that to say, how are we going to be able to conserve water? And this is a concern with every sector of user. So in agriculture, they're concerned with conservation. The city and the municipalities and the water utilities are concerned with conservation. And the environmental sector is maybe concerned in a different way. They're concerned more about conserving wildlife habitat and questions like that. So conservation was a concern for everyone. So our overall goal in this project is to use modeling approaches to look at some of these concerns and try to evaluate future scenarios and then how we might improve outcomes in the future through either changes in management, changes in technology, changes in policy. It's a really big task. So we're using basically two main modeling approaches. One is a model that we built ourselves within the project, and some of the people are here that worked on this, Dr. Deanna Pennington, and I don't know if Frank Ward is here, but he from New Mexico State, but he was one of the leaders in this part of the project. And this is a model that can be used on maybe a larger scale and to answer some of the big scale questions that we have. So what we did in this model, we call it the bucket model, and it's because we just look at the major water sources that we're dealing with, which include the river and the two aquifers, as just buckets. And we're trying to calculate what are all the inputs to the bucket and what are all the losses or outputs from the bucket. So it turns out a pretty useful approach for looking at some bigger scale, maybe basin-wide or even sub-basin questions that we might have. And then the other modeling approach that we're using is using SWOT linked with ModFlow. And this is a much more process-based model, and the results are in much finer scale, so you can address questions on a much finer spatial scale. But of course, it's much more complicated and more time-consuming in terms of getting results and so forth. Dr. Ali Mirchi, who is here, and also Dr. Zhuping Xing from Texas A&M have been the leaders in developing this model for our part of the basin. And we have now working models for the linked SWOT and ModFlow. I also forgot Alfredo. Alfredo has also been working on this on the Mexico side. So we have now working versions of this model for all the parts of the basin that we're interested in. So just to show you just a little bit of results, I don't have time to show you everything that we have done up to this point, but I'm going to show you a few results, especially from the bucket model, just to convince you that this might be a useful tool. I also failed to mention that Dr. Deanna Pennington worked on a user interface for this bucket model so that it makes it much more usable for users. It's a user-friendly interface where users could create their own scenarios and do evaluation of different scenarios themselves. So these are some results for the annual flow at the El Paso gauge and at the Fort Quitman gauge. The dots on these two graphs are the actual values, observed, measured values, and the line is the line that we simulated using the bucket model. So you can see it's pretty good. A few dry years in 2002 to about 2004 or 5, we were off a little bit, but I think modelers in general would say this is pretty good. So we're pretty confident in what we can do with this bucket model. And then Dr. Gutzler, Dave Gutzler, identified a climate scenario so that we could do a future projection, a 50-year projection out into the future. And this graph shows some results for that from 2020 up to 2070. The black line is the combined reservoir storage in Elephant Butte and Caballo reservoirs. The purple line is the Caballo gauge. The yellow line is the San Marcial gauge. And it was kind of interesting because in this particular scenario that Dave chose, the decade of the 2020s were wet years, and you can see that. Actually, there was pretty good storage in the reservoirs and also good flow at San Marcial gauge. But then following that, several years of drought, about a 10-year drought period or maybe more. And there are two things I would say about this graph. One is kind of the general trend line for what's coming into the Elephant Butte Reservoir, though there's lots of ups and downs. The general trend line is down, just as Dave Gutzler showed a few minutes ago. And then the other thing is the system doesn't seem very resilient. After this period of really dry years in the 2030s, there's not much recovery in terms of the reservoir. And I guess maybe this shouldn't be surprising. If you think about Elephant Butte Reservoir as your checking account, if you spend it out every year, you shouldn't be surprised that it's not being built up over time. So this just gives you an example of some of the modeling that we can do with this bucket model. In the next few months, we're going to be doing a lot more with the SWAT mod flow, and maybe in the future we'll have some additional results to report about that. We also looked at the aquifers and how well we could do on that. We have a couple of actual wells here, one in the Mesilla Basin on the left and one from the Waco Bolson on the right. And what's shown here is the bars are how much groundwater pumping was occurring each year. And then, again, the dots are actual observations of the depth to groundwater, and the lines of what we simulated using the bucket model. So again, does pretty good, a little off in a few places, but not bad. So in summary, at this point in our project, we still have 2 more years to go, but we have engaged quite a number of stakeholders from all sectors. And we've talked about the future of water in this area. We've identified the important research questions, and actually we've started working on those research questions. We've developed this bucket model and the user interface, and it's been tested, calibrated, and validated with the stakeholders. SWAT and ModFlow is in the final stages of testing and validating. We'll be ready to use that very shortly in all of the basin area. We've looked so far at some climate scenarios that have included prolonged drought, but we'd like to do more. One of the questions that the El Paso water utilities gave us was, what are the climatic or the weather conditions where there would be no releases from Elephant Butte Reservoir? And so we think we can answer that question using our bucket model, and we're going to try to do that. And in the coming months, we're going to start looking at identifying and evaluating some potential interventions. What can we do in terms of either management, new technologies, policy changes, whatever, to have some better outcomes for the future. So thank you very much.